But when you try those different parts, I think one thing it's a heavy word and a hard word. Your your nature of sin does follow you wherever you go, whether it's into a retreat center for yoga, or whether it's you know when you put your headphones on to do a meditation app like Headspace. When you encounter Jesus, the transformation isn't just transformation, but there's a cleansing of conscience. There's an ongoing cleansing of guilt and shame that we all struggle with. I think anyone who endeavors other paths, right? And I say this from my own experience, however hard you try, you'll always feel that you're falling short. And you'll always have to grapple with guilt and shame and self-condemnation. It's only in the meeting of Jesus Christ that that burden is lifted.
G'day everyone, Dave Deane here, and I'm really excited to share with you a conversation that I've had with a dear friend of mine, Rahil Patel, who will be joining us from Oxford, England. I first met Rahil and his beautiful family when we studied together over at the OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. And honestly, at the time, I had little awareness as to his background. Rahil is a softly spoken, unassuming man with a remarkable story that cuts across geographical and spiritual frontiers in his pursuit for love and inner peace. As he explains in his book, Found by Love, a Hindu priest encounters Jesus, Rahil's name in Hindi means one who takes the beauty from the past into the future and leaves behind the bitterness. But for the grace of God, I think Rahil lives up to his name. His story is one of transformation, and what we're about to hear, I think, is something that will connect with all of us, Easterners, Westerners, in-betweeners, as we're all essentially pilgrims in this life searching for a place to belong, a place to call home. Well, Rahil, my friend, it is wonderful to see you again, and I'm very thankful for the time that we have together to have a chat, my evening and your morning.
Yeah. Thanks, David, for having me. It's great to see you again after a long time. We spent a
Yeah,
good 9 months together here in Oxford, and it's just great to see you after such a while. And it's lovely to see you flourishing so well.
yeah, you too. And half a decade ago, and a lot has changed, hasn't it? In the world, COVID is what drove us apart, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, quite abruptly because I was in India,
Mm,
and I think I still saw you. I landed, and a few days later, we had lockdown in the UK, and I think you guys were all desperate to get
mm,
your flights out of the UK before they shut things down. And so we didn't even get to
hmm
say proper goodbyes. And it was
mm,
really, it was a weird ending to a
it
wonderful
was.
9 months. I don't think I met half of the class before they left, but I got to see
Yeah.
you, Julie. Um, so, yeah, strange. Lots has happened
Mm,
since then.
absolutely. So this was at, for anyone listening, this was at the OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, where Rahil and I met, and we got to know each other's families. And um, sometimes it's said, Rahil, that people are just a product of where they were raised. And to have somebody like yourself, we're going to be hearing about your story, born and raised into a Hindu home and family, to be at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. There's something that's happened in between. So, I think
With a
I've
few
shared
years
with
as
you.
well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've shared with you, and that my family has some connections with India. My wife's from Kerala. My mother was born and raised in Andhra Pradesh, and I've had an opportunity to visit India some time ago myself. And if I was to summarize that country in one word, it would be contrast. India is a land of contrasts. And as I've been thinking about your story, and I just reread your biography, Found by Love, earlier this week, it strikes me you could probably summarize your life with that one word contrast as well. So just wondering if you could take us back to that beginning, to where it all began with your parents, the life that they had in Kenya, in contrast to your life there growing up in the UK.
Yes, so currently, I'd say there are about 1.8 million Indians in the UK. Over half of them are from East Africa. So Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania were also British colonies. So my great granddad left India in 1898 to settle there in Kenya. And that's where my dad was born. My mother was born there. And my granddad, my father's father, started a construction business in the late 40s, 50s, did really well. At the height of his business, he had about 4,000 people working for him, built most of Kenya's infrastructure in those 2 decades. And then after these countries were given independence by the British, there was a lot of stress between government and the Indian population because most of the Indian population had British passports. So one of the conditions of staying in Kenya was to give up your British passport and stay or just leave. And there was also another horrible side of what was happening to Indians in East Africa. Over the decades, they had managed to make good money. They were, they're very good business people, very family oriented, very frugal with finances. And so it came to a point where Indians were also called the Jews of Africa. And that gave a lot of Africans an excuse to persecute, to punish Indians. So it just became very volatile. My granddad was given a phone call by the government to shut down the business overnight. He was only 52. He had a heart attack and died instantly. So you have a huge empire, massive sums of money, and everything got just taken away within a matter of 17 months. So my family came to England with British passports. I was about 3 months old. I was born in Kenya. But, long story short, we were doing a lot of back and forth between Kenya and the UK. So my elder brother was born in the UK. So we came to the UK like most Indians here from East Africa with nothing, just our passports. And so that was a big contrast. And to be fair to my parents, they had a very, very luxurious lifestyle in East Africa. Many servants, different houses, luxury cars, open accounts in jewelry shops and electronic shops. And so money was never a problem. And coming to England with just a suitcase and a British passport, it was a struggle financially. I remember as a kid, my mum and dad stacking shelves in the newsagent shop that they bought just near Milton Keynes, which is just an hour or so north of London. Newsagents, for those who might not know, is a grocery store or corner shop, as some call it. So it was a very hard life for my parents. But one thing they were keen on, like most Indians, was to not have so much of a contrasting culture. So even though in Kenya, they were around a Indian community a lot of the time. They were Hindus, practicing Hindus. So when they came to London, even though there was a financial contrast, in faith, they wanted to ensure that they maintained their culture, their cuisine, language, and practice of faith with God. So they attended a Hindu temple every weekend. So some things were contrast, other things were continuous.
Okay, so maybe it's a good point now to just orient some of our listeners with Hinduism. I think Hinduism is represented by about just over 1 billion people around the world, but in Australia, it's not as well known as other religions like Christianity or Islam. So, could you help unpack for us, I guess, what Hinduism is, and maybe even address some of the, I don't want to say stereotypes, but some of the Western ideas of the Eastern religions, things like peace and tranquility and meditation and so on. We're going to hear more about this, no doubt, as we move forward, but just, I guess, a bit of
Sure.
an orientation.
So it's interesting that you say that, and I often address this in meetings because Hinduism is the fastest growing religion in Australia. If you read the reports given by the Australian government, that's because of immigration, not because of conversion. A lot of Australian Caucasians do convert to the Hare Rama Hare Krishna movement. So, out of the Hare Rama Hare Krishna tradition in Australia, around 60,000 followers, a good 70% are Australian Caucasian believers of that particular tradition. So it is the fastest growing religion in Australia in terms of growth rate, and that's because of immigration. And I think it is important for your viewers, listeners to know that that will continue because of the Australian government's agreement with India on immigration for young professionals, which is very similar to that of the UK. So the acronym is MATES, Mobility Ask for Young Professionals. I forgot the full title, but you'll see a lot more students coming into Australia in the coming years. So that number will rise. And I was closely watching the Australian election between Albanese and Morrison, and it was quite evident to see how they were really pitching to the Indian population by having Friday curry nights and so on and so forth. So I guess it does depend on where you're living in Australia. So you might feel that people don't know much here. Australia. First you have the Brits, then you have New Zealand, then you have China, then you have India. So just an awareness that for your listeners that, and I don't mean this in a fearful way or some kind of scaremongering, but that will naturally grow because of Australia's position in the world economically and politically as it moves away from China. And if you look at India, 600 million people are under the age of 25, right? So there are so many places for universities in India. And the average age of an Indian is 27, right? So 1/5 of the world lives in India. And there's not enough space in universities, colleges, and jobs for these young professionals. So Australia will see a lot more students coming, like the UK is. UK now has overtaken Indian students in the UK, has overtaken China and the European Union as a whole. So a lot of universities here are seeing Hindus coming into their Christian unions. It's fascinating to see people searching. Why I highlight this before I come to your question is because data suggests that when young Hindus leave their family homes, even within India, to study in big cities, they are more often than not willing to explore other faiths. So that's why I highlight the importance of immigration into Australia and why it's the fastest growing religion. The word Hinduism, to answer your question, is actually a geographical term. It's not one religion. It's fair and more accurate to say it's a faith, it's a fellowship of Hindu religions. So the word Hinduism is derived from the Indus River, which is in the northwest of India. The river now sits in modern day Pakistan. And the coin Indians or Indus or Hindus was first coined by the Greek historian Herodotus in the 8th century BC. So he understood that people on the other side of that river, he called them Indus or Indians. And later that phrase was carried on by the Arabs. And then because the Brits found old, cities underneath this beautiful arid land in northwest India of civilizations going back to 3000 BC, 3500 BC. And it was mainly around this river, Indus. The Brits called the country India. and hence the word Indians. So Hinduism is more about a group of different tribes settling around this river, mostly coming from Central Asia. Why I give that potentially boring background is because that helps you understand the fellowship of Hindu religions. Because these tribes, when they were called Hindus by the Greeks and the Arabs, they were all very different tribes with different beliefs, different practices, different cultures, but they were just very happy to mix and stay together. So, if you want to just stand back and have a look at this world of Hindu religions, one continuous trait is that it always absorbs from other cultures and evolves. It absorbs and evolves. It's not so hell bent, as they say, to stay in one structure and one form. So, the idea of a Hindu temple, you have about 94 Hindu temples in Australia. That concept is a Greek import from the 4th century. The idea of God being in an image, in an icon, whether it be marble or copper, is also a Greek import. A lot of Christianity has been taken into Hinduism by Hindu conservative Orthodox practicing Hindus. The Sunday get together in a Hindu temple is a direct copy of Christianity. So that's to help your listeners and viewers understand that it's very complex. It's a fellowship of different religions, often contrasting each other, contradicting each other, and then complementing each other. That's why there is no one founder, there is no one book, there is no such concept as a beginning. And this is why Christian theologians, apologists, have found it really difficult to write about that world because they go in with the Abrahamic infrastructure that they're so used to, and they try to fit things in. Let me just explain. There was some years ago, there was a crusade, which is the worst word to use in India. But anyway, there was a crusade taking place in the city of Mysore, I think it was in the south, where your family are largely from, that sort of era. And there's a famous temple there called Meenakshi. So the Christians got permission from the local government to write on the walls to advertise this evangelical event. And so on the walls, they wrote, Jesus is the answer. Jesus is the answer. Jesus is the answer. So the Hindus then got permission from the local authorities to write on the other walls. And so they wrote, what's the question? You see, we don't have your question. And historically, as I've read over the years, people have been writing, they keep searching for answers to Christian questions in that world, and they get stuck. Um, but to help your listeners and viewers, Hinduism is more about practice. So when you meet a Hindu, you respectfully ask, "What is your practice? What is your method? Yeah, what is your method for moksha, which is the liberation of the self from birth and rebirth?" Hindus don't seek salvation. Forgiveness is a concept completely peripheral to their whole world. So you start by that, and how are you practicing for the liberation of the self? So that doesn't answer your question fairly. I can understand that, but why I wanted to help is that your question is a very fair, understandable Christian question. You see what I mean? And this is where it's been so difficult to understand that world. If you think about it, William Carey snuck into India in 1793 against the wishes of the East India Company. And then 1813, Wilberforce pushed Parliament to have missionaries in India. You have 150 years of missionaries in India who have done work in India at that time, better work than they've done anywhere else in the West. Some of the best orphanages in India. The world's first mental hospital was in India. All the Christians did this phenomenal work. Yet in 1947, when India got its independence, only 1% of the 400 million people were Christians. So it begs the question that what happened? What were they trying to do? What went wrong? You built the best hospitals in India. Still today, they are the best. Best schools, Christian schools. They still are the best schools in India today. And yet this whole bringing people to Christ didn't succeed as much. So different traditions follow different texts, to answer your question. Hindus are not fussed about evidence of a beginning. They are not fussed about who wrote their text. They are not fussed about when those texts were written. They often love the stories of their tradition. And so when a Christian understands the stories and engages as a result of that, it's more of an effective conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. There's a lot there. I guess Christianity is named after a person, as you say. Hinduism is not after a person; it's after a place.
Yeah.
And Christianity has this monotheistic view of God, one personal, transcendent God. Hinduism is far more diverse. It's very interesting what you
Again,
said there
you
about.
pointed out a really good point. Hinduism does have one God, but different incarnations. And different traditions will worship those different incarnations. So when you go into a temple, you see different icons. Some of them are just angelic beings who worship the same one God. So when Herbert Risley, the brilliant, bureaucrat from Britain, did a consensus in India in 1912, even after his research, and he was very meticulous, this Brit, he said they believe in one God. But the difference is that one God in that world doesn't mind if you worship him through a different incarnation of him or through a guru. He's not a jealous God in that sense, like the Christian God, who wants the whole heart for him.
Mm. And the touch point here, well, to what you said earlier about Hinduism, Hindus being more open to exploring, other faiths or coming along to Christian groups here in Australia, even. I guess that starts to make sense given that particular view of the divine or deities. It also starts to make sense as well of maybe the more inclusive, pluralistic mindset of the West today as well.
Yeah,
That seems to, I guess, have a draw to more of the Eastern mystic
yeah.
religions because of things like that. Yeah.
Because of things like that,
And as you mentioned,
sorry, because of things like that, Dave, and we'll touch on it later, also because Christianity in the West has stopped offering the rich heritage practices of the Christian
mm,
faith, right? The word meditate
mhm,
was in the Bible 600 years before Buddha was born.
mm, mhm.
So
Yeah, I am keen to explore that with you more later on. Okay, so your parents have moved from Kenya to London. From you were born in Nairobi, and now you're in London to the UK. They've had this big contrast of a life of, I guess, luxury to having to really work hard on a coalface there in the UK to make ends meet. So they start going along to a local Hindu temple denomination. Could you tell us what home life was like for you there in the UK with your brother, as you're just these young Hindu boys in a Western country?
so I can go back at least from age 8. I can remember, like, every morning we were practicing Orthodox Hindus. So our tradition didn't even drink alcohol, definitely no meat. Any foods in scripture that say invoke anger, like onion and garlic, you don't even touch that. Um, so we would wake up in the morning, and before drinking, having breakfast, you have a bath. Then you have your personal prayer kit. You pray for 30 minutes. Then you go downstairs into the house shrine. So every Hindu home has a house shrine. Some Hindu families dedicate a whole room to their house shrine. So we had a whole room for our house shrine. You pray there for 15, 20 minutes. Then you have breakfast and then you go to school. When you come back from school as well, you wash your hands and you go first into the house shrine. You pray. You just view the images, honor them, pray to them, and then you do your homework. And before the family sits down to eat, which is around 6 o'clock in the evening, the whole family goes into the house shrine where it's located into the room. You pray for 25, 30 minutes together. Whatever food you're eating, you offer that to the images. And then we sit down to eat. And then, you watch TV or do whatever. And then before bedtime, again, another 20 minutes, the family would get together and pray. And then it's bedtime. So that's your basic day to day routine at home. And on the weekends, you all go in the evening to the local Hindu temple, which is from 6 to 9 o'clock. You sit in the congregation or you play in the children's area, and you listen to the sermon, you listen to the worship, which was for me really, really hard, sitting cross-legged, just staring, straight ahead, what is going on, and not wanting to sit there. This first temple was in North London, in Islington. It was ironically a converted church building, and it was now a Hindu temple. So that was day-to-day life.
Mm. And at one point in your book, you mentioned that I guess you were moving between faiths, contrasting faiths. So it was Christianity at school, that's what you were being taught, and then it was Hinduism at home. And you make this comment that it was very strange that school felt like home and home felt like a school.
So that's a great observation that you've made from the book. I was very comfortable and I loved at school singing hymns in the morning. Obviously, I didn't know what they meant. Every morning from primary school onwards, you had to, in assembly, sing from the hymn book. Before lunch, I can still remember the prayer. I was what, 9, 10? For what we are about to receive, may the Lord make us truly thankful. Amen. That's what I prayed as a child. I still remember it. And thankfulness isn't a concept in Hinduism. That's why sometimes when you say thank you too much to a Hindu, they think you're being superficial, but it's because it's so ingrained in a Christian's life. And then, we used to pray before going home, and I didn't know why, I just felt so comfortable there. Maybe at home, it wasn't just the Hindu aspect of life, but home life was difficult. My parents were struggling to live a new life, in England, which was so, so different to the life in Kenya. So school was like a sanctuary, and it was very Christian, and home was very Hindu. At the time, even in hindsight, I don't want to just put tags on things that might not be there. All I remember is that it was just so much more comfortable. I was the only colored person in the school, my brother and myself, sorry. And so it was just such a lovely, I still remember singing those hymns. I was 8, 9 years old, 10 years old, and still remember where I was standing, still remember the size of the hymn book, where you pick it up from in the classroom and where you take it, and if you ask me, do you remember what you were doing in the Hindu temple at that time? I can't give you any vivid pictures of what really took root in my heart. I think I don't remember picking that up or looking at that or this or that at that age, at 8 and 9. So that's why, I wrote it that way in the book, that it was like home. Everything was just so attractive. And yet you don't know why at that age, why it's attractive.
And then you mentioned a big change when your guru, came to town, and he kind of identified some giftings in your life. There was a big speech. Do you just want to maybe outline what that pivotal moment was all
So I
about.
think the early teen, sorry, no, 15, 16, things started changing. I was, you know, when you write a book, you start unpicking things and you start realizing why you did some of the things you did. Things at home were still quite difficult. And by 16, for some reason, I don't know if it was just that, the difficulties at home, or I just had this desire to search for God and just go deeper into God. So I started going to the temple more. I don't know how that switch took place from not wanting to go when I was 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, and then suddenly wanting to go even more so. I just started going to the temple more. I was getting involved in the activities. I was given the charge of the youth activities by the time I was 16. And then the guru of this tradition came to London. And this tradition has many temples in Australia as well. And I was asked to speak in the congregation on Hindu scripture. There were about 3,000 people there, and I gave a talk on one of the scriptures, and he was incredibly happy, and so was the audience. And in that tradition, the guru is like the incarnation of God on earth, you know. So if you made him happy, it's a huge thing, not just spiritually, but even for your own ego that you don't know of at the time. And I went after the talk, I went to bow at his feet, which is tradition. And I still remember him saying to me that, you gave a very good talk. You should be a Hindu monk or a priest, you have a good gift. And so for me, immediately I thought, okay, this is my destiny. This is my calling. Wow. God's actually told me where I'm going to be going in life, and it be full of peace and fun and joy and just meditate, chant, worship, read, preach. And I was now 16, just finished my GCSEs, and after that 2 years, I just became even more radical and keen to leave and go to India to train in a monastery. And I did that. I think by the age of 19, I had left England.
Well, I mean, I can imagine as a 16-year-old being told by who you understood to be God on earth that this is what you should do. Um, yeah, that's what you do.
That's what you do. Yeah.
And so it was, yeah. How did so that's 16, and then 19 is when you took flight to go to India. How was all of this going down with your parents
Oh,
at
not very
home?
well at all. Because to be a monk in this tradition, the idea of detachment was so intense that you could never speak with your parents ever again. So all emotional ties to your past have to be broken. You can never get married. You can't even talk to women or look at them intentionally. So the vows of celibacy are very intense. You don't get paid. So there's no security of if this doesn't work out, you come back, there's nothing. You can't even touch money. If you touch money accidentally, you have to wash your hands 25 times. So for parents, it's looking back, it's just as much of a sacrifice to give their child away as it is for the child itself to go on this journey. So it didn't go down well with them at all. In Indian culture, there's a lot of pride in what your children do, what they achieve, when they get their lovely home and when they get their Mercedes Benz, and it's all about that, in Indian culture. And that's something I'll just point out here, and that's an important distinction to understand, because in the Christian faith, you can't serve God and mammon, right? In Hinduism, you can. In fact, you must, right? Unless you become a monk, dharma, artha, kama, moksha. Dharma means spiritual duty, artha means wealth. You must pursue wealth for the sake of your family and your local temple. It's a pursuit, it's actually a spiritual pursuit. So, in that world, it's a massive thing to sacrifice everything, not just family. but career and wealth, because it doesn't have the underpinnings that Christianity has about wealth. So it's a huge shock. I didn't like it, but I was so radical. As you may have read, I just ran away.
Yeah, that was gut wrenching, and before we went hit the record button here, we're talking about what that must have been like for your parents. And now that you're a dad, since writing that, I'm a dad since I first read your book. I read that in a different way as a parent. Like it's gut wrenching
Yeah,
to think about a home. And I guess that was something else that struck me as I was going through this. On the one hand, your parents or yourself or Hindus, and I don't want to overgeneralize here, but there is a strong commitment to what you believe, and yet I still don't want my son to become a swami, to become a
yeah,
member of the
yeah.
priesthood, because I know that that's going to cost so much.
True, and that is common amongst parents in that tradition. It is common. It's not easy, you know. Um, but now I think after I left, I've heard there are a lot more processes in place. That there are many more agreements. There has to be signed documents and things like that. Um, but what also encourages you, like in the Christian faith, you have Satan, the enemy. In Hinduism, anything that distracts you from God is Maya. Anything, right? Which means Maya is the Hindu term across all Hindu religions of evil. So let's call it a force that pushes you to ignorance, right? So in that world, you're constantly told that even your parents can be Maya, even your spouse can be Maya, even your children can be Maya. Anything or anyone that hinders you to go closer to God is Maya. So you have that also, even though you cause your parents that huge heartache, you have that huge philosophical doctrinal idea that, but this is where I see where this is coming from, right? Is Maya. And so you push through with spiritual vigor, believing that you're just doing the right thing against the enemy.
Okay, so from Kenya to London, at age 19, you moved from London to India, to this oasis in the middle of the uh, Gujarat
Gujarat.
desert, where you
Gujarat,
underwent
yeah.
this rigorous Gujarat. You underwent this rigorous training. Could you just step us through a day in the life of Rahil as you're there at that monastery?
So Gujarat is a state in the northwest of India, and the southern kind of western part of it is quite arid. And India has 31 states. Most of the Indians in Australia are from Gujarat in the northwest. And this monastery was on a 250-acre campus in that arid part of the state. And so every morning you wake up around 4:30. You have a cold water bath. You're only allowed to use hot water if you're ill or if you're of age, you know. And then you sit down for 45 minutes and you have your prayer kit and you pray, you meditate. And then at 6 o'clock, the bell rings for corporate worship in the temple. So you go for that. After that, which lasts a good 25 minutes, everyone has chores. You either sweep the grounds, and that rota changes every 14 days. You help in the kitchen, you wash the utensils, or you go and pick flowers for the garlands, for the icons. And there are different things or you cut the vegetables. And so those chores continue for a good hour. And then breakfast everyone has together at around 7:30. Sorry, yeah, 7 quarter to 8, everyone has breakfast together. So when I was there were about 150 of us training at the same time. 16 of us were from England and America. And so you have your breakfast, and the first lecture starts at 8:20 in the morning. That goes on for a good 45 minutes, and you are expected to take notes on that. Every 2 weeks, there's a 3-hour paper on the morning lecture. And then your classes start throughout the day. You study all different Hindu philosophies, different Hindu texts. You study world religions as well. And basically, your day passes in study, reading, revising for exams. You do get a nap time in the afternoon for about an hour, but the classes and studies continue till about 11 o'clock at night. And in the middle of this, you have 5 corporate worship moments where you all get together and you worship together. So that is a compulsory. And then you must fast at least 5 to 7 times a month. So that's fasting in that context means without food and water for 36 hours. So that was horrendous. I remember one morning literally crying before I walked up the temple steps. It was so hot. It was around 40, 45 Celsius and 36 hours without food and water. It was just crazy. I still remember where I was standing when I was crying. It was so hard. But that was the sort of lifestyle. And you are monitored as well in that first year to see whether you can cope with this life. 45% of applicants are sent home after the first year because the mentors sense or notice that, look, this is not for you. You're not really good at coping with it, because it's also about the mind. Yeah, you're talking to senior folk and they're gauging where your mind is at. Are you able to control your mind? um, this is going to be a life of celibacy. This is not going to be a life of career. This is not going to be a life of money, you know. um, so are you managing your emotions, your envy, your jealousy, and all those kind of things? So it's hard.
Okay, so 6 years and then ordination. And just to clarify, your brother was here with you as well. So your
Yeah.
parents, two kids were gone. And did you have any contact with your parents when you were over there at all?
None, no contact really. I mean, there was a brief moment where my mother came hoping to see me, but I just wasn't keen to see her. I was just so, focused on pursuing this. I just didn't want to have that.
And okay, and
But
then
I
you
must
you
say
graduate ordination, but
I just
what?
say one. Sorry, there's just one thing, Dave. I must
No, go ahead.
say for your audience, there was one moment. This is November 1991, November, December. This is 3 months into my training. I'm just 19. I was upstairs in the temple prostrating to the images, all 150 of us. And I remember where I was standing, and it was at that time, the bells are ringing, the drums are beating, everyone's singing loud. I'm singing, and suddenly I hear this voice. It's not an audible voice, but a sense that someone just said something to me, and it was two questions. Have you made the right choice? Are you in the right place? You know, and that really shook me because it just felt so authentic. So I even remember, many decades later, I walked over to the balcony briefly and I looked down. It was a huge 3-story temple, and for a second I thought, what have I done? And then I just thought again, it's evil coming in the way. But then that was the beginning, I must say to your audience, of doubts and questions, because I noticed that monks who were monks for 30, 40 years, doing all these practices and meditations, the internal world wasn't changing, you know? And I thought, what's wrong? Why am I not changing? Why is there no transformation inside? So that was a really pivotal moment, but I just pushed through that thinking it's Maya, but it just lingered constantly from that day onwards throughout the 6 year training. I put it to the guru. He said, you think too much, it'll go away, you will change. I said, I've been doing all these fasts and meditation, but I'm not, the internal change is not there. I don't see it in those who have been monks for 40 years. He said, don't think too much. So yeah, that was that.
So, so when a Swami, a Hindu priest, leaves Like when I graduated engineering, I had to get on Seek or put the word out to find a job. Uh, what did that look like for you? And now it was a 2 decade career, but what did you walk into?
So first 2 years I was in Mumbai, looking after the youth activities, 1996 to 97. Then 97 I was placed in London, which is like the flagship temple for Europe. And then we travel in pairs. So eventually, as my role grew, I was in charge of Europe and Russia to build temples, build Hindu congregations across Europe and Russia, whilst also helping teaching and preaching in North America. They felt that I had a gift in speaking, so I was taken to America often to speak at the national conventions, various conferences. But these were the two worlds I was inhabiting in terms of posting. So I was on a plane at one period in the 15-year period after leaving the monastery. It's probably on a plane every 2 weeks, doing 60 to 90,000 miles a year, setting up centers. So Europe was very barren for the Hindu tradition, and so over that period, I helped set up about three temples and 15 different centers across Europe, from Moscow to Sweden to Austria to Portugal. So that was the role to fulfill in the midst of your personal practice.
So fundraising, would you call yourself an evangelist for Hinduism?
Oh, definitely. Um, you're spreading, you're getting people to convert to this tradition, but you wouldn't necessarily, unlike the Hare Rama Hare Krishnas, we weren't that keen on converting Europeans. To be frank, white Europeans. It was mainly Indians who were residing in these cities in Europe. We wanted them to follow this Hindu tradition. So evangelical in the Indian context or the Hindu context.
Got it. And you were amidst your travels in New York, September 11, 2001. And as I understand, you stayed in New York for some time, and that was a pretty key moment, like, of introspection. I know you're undergoing some pretty uh, intense physical struggles as well. You just want to reflect on what was going on during that time.
Oh, so yeah, 2001, I was in New York on 9/11. I was meant to go into Manhattan to see an ENT surgeon. But before that, I had to have some blood tests. And the doctor that came to do the blood test was late. So I was quite annoyed because my plan was to see the doctor in Manhattan and then go and walk around the World Trade Center. Oh, this is 9/11. So he came late. He was around 8 o'clock-ish and in the morning. But he still took my bloods, and then we went into Manhattan. And then as we're driving into Manhattan, I saw the first tower on fire. So we just thought it was a fire. We turned a few more corners, and before we got into Holland Tunnel, we saw the second, tower on fire, and then everything stopped. We were told to, leave and turn back, and it was a river of fire brigades going into Manhattan. And we turned on the radio, and at that point, the first tower collapsed, got back to the temple in Flushing, New York. And on TV, I saw the second tower collapse, which was, I, I still remember watching that on TV where I was standing in the temple, and it was a huge, huge, huge shock to my system. It really made me think, because a friend of mine, Hindu, who shared the same birthday with me, died in the World Trade Center. He was working for Merrill Lynch at the time. We always kind of knew each other because we shared the same birthday. So that was a strange moment where I thought, okay, why did I survive that? I mean, I was going to go there, So it got me thinking. The other thing that got me thinking a lot was my physical health kept taking a toll. I was in and out of hospitals a lot. And I kind of knew that there was some emotional, I didn't know it was spiritual, but I knew there was an emotional aspect to my physical illness. Um, the other aspect that got me thinking was in my travels in Europe, you know, I went into Europe just over 400 times in total. I was just fascinated with the image of the cross, you know. Um, Now I had forgotten my primary school years. I didn't know what the cross meant, the Christian cross. But I remember just love looking at it. It was just very attractive in Europe. And so I started walking in and out of churches a lot. While I was in Europe, I would do my talks, meet the followers who were there. Then in my free time, I'd go and wander around a church, just found the space attractive. Looking at the cross was attractive. So, health, this 9/11 moment, America, Christian cross, it just started becoming, so many threads started taking, pace in my heart and mind. And it got so bad, my health, by 2007, I was then admitted into the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, Florida. And for those of your listeners, viewers who know, like that's like the creme de la creme. After that, there's nothing except Jesus, I guess. But that's the thing. And I was 40 by that age. And I had 5 doctors overseeing me. Each of them were chairmen of their departments. One of them still a friend, stays in touch, And they looked at my file sent by the doctors in London and said, "What is wrong with you?" you know, And it was such a pertinent question. They were asking something different. This file of all your conditions is one thing, but there's something else that's wrong with you. You know, and it kind of I don't know if it was prophetic or if it's God. It kind of they pinpointed something back in 1991 when I was prostrating in the temple, and that lingering doubt: am I in the right place? Am I doing the right thing? Why isn't there change? That lingering thing that continued, which you justify as evil and you distract yourself from with busyness, it just doesn't go, right? And when they asked me, I remember them sitting there, "What is wrong with you?" I kind of felt like these guys know something I don't know, you know, and it's not just my medical condition. So that was 2000 and sorry, it's 2011. 11. This is from 9/11 to 2000. It was a 10-year period of these interactions with the Christian cross, my health, lots of travel, busyness, even trying self-help books to get internal change. I mean, how desperate can you get? You know.
Were you reading any scripture at that time, or?
Interestingly enough, I was an avid reader. I think I still am an avid reader. I did ask a close, trustworthy friend to find me to get. We went to a bookshop, and I told him to buy me a children's Bible. And I just said, I just want to see what these guys, these Christians, talk about. What is it? And I remember taking it back to my office in the monastery, and I opened the book, and I think it just opened to the book of Matthew. That's all I remember. I read a few passages, and I remember where I was sitting, and it kind of like, when I read it, there was this sense of refreshing, this drawing. I read about 3 lines, Dave. I didn't even know what it meant, but it was so attractive. It was so as if something is speaking back and trying to reach out. I quickly shut the Bible because I'm wearing orange robes in a Hindu monastery. I shut the Bible and I had a library of books. I kind of hid it within the library of books. But I had a couple of moments like that. I was reading a book on Vivekananda, the great Hindu philosopher, and I was engrossed in the book. And again, it wasn't audible, but I sensed someone say simply, "Jesus Christ of Nazareth," And it shook me. God, this is. what? This is really authentic. This is really beautiful, attractive. Um, so yeah, 2011, I was in the clinic 3 days a week. On the weekends, I still had to preach around North America across the various Hindu temples. But it was those 10 months in that clinic that I was forced to stay still and not distract myself with busyness, where all those lingering doubts, questions started surfacing. They weren't fully articulated, but they started surfacing in the mind.
Mm. And so after that time there in the States, I think it's where your prologue actually kind of picks up this intense scene where you're catching a flight to go see your Guruji in India. He wants to have a conversation with you, and there's
Yeah,
this big build up to what's he going to say, what's going on here. There's a
yeah,
lot of whispers, a lot of rumors, a lot of talk.
yeah.
Could you step us through that pivotal moment in your
So,
life?
just to give you some backdrop before my visit to India to see the Guru, due to my travels in Europe, engagement with the Christian cross, different people, I began to have a very different view of God. And so my Hindu theology and philosophy was being influenced and it was changing. And this came out in my talks. And I noticed that the congregation was really enjoying it. I was in Orlando in 2007 speaking at the National Convention. I was giving a keynote speech. And I spoke from a Hindu scripture, but then I gave a narrative. I offered a narrative of what God should be like or ought to be like based on my experiences of travel, the Christian cross, and God being, bigger than in just a guru. I didn't say it just like that, but God is bigger than a guru or in an icon or in a temple. And like everywhere else, I got a standing ovation. It was 7,000 people. I sat next to my friend who was a monk, and he said, "Wow, how did you translate that Hindu text like that? That was amazing." And I thought to myself, gosh, if only you knew that had nothing to do with Hinduism. So that was obvious that by now I had a senior position. I was one of the organization's prominent speakers. So I had full access to the guru. No one could intervene in that. I had a lot of favor, a lot of favor. Looking back, I'm grateful for the favor that I had. I never had to go through so many hoops to get things done. I could just make a phone call and the guru would take my call. This is past all the senior swamis, the trustees, international leadership. I had direct access. So no one said anything to me about my theology. No one had the courage to do that. And I just continued. After my illness, I went back to India just to see the guru, because I thought, he's still my father figure, still my guru, going to promote his work. But by then, the whispers had gone to his ear about my theology, my doctrine. So this was Mumbai. I landed in Mumbai in 2011, December. And a friend, a fellow monk, came up to me before I went upstairs and said, "Look, be careful. There's a plot against you. Just say yes to whatever Guruji says to you." And I thought, why? What? I mean, say yes to what? Anyway, so I had a personal meeting with him, and I always had personal, private meetings with him. Um, and I did have favor to leverage his decisions. He listened to me a lot. But this time when I went in, other senior monks came in as well. And I knew, okay, something was up. Long story short, it was about my theology, my doctrine. There were other issues which I clarify in the book, but at this point it just got too much. They wanted me, you know, not to have a voice, so they said, "Let's keep him in India." I said no to God for the first time in 20 years. I said, "I'm not going to stay in India. I'm going to go to England." He said, "Okay, let me put you in a small town in America." I said no again to God, and I didn't even know how I said no to God, and everyone around me is like gasping, like, what is this guy saying? These are all monks who've been monks for 40, 50 years. Why is he saying no? So then I just sighed and I just said, look, instead of this back and forth, look, let me go home. I don't want to be a Swami anymore, you know? And there was just silence in the room. And shockingly, but with a relief, he said, okay, go. But on two conditions: you're never allowed to give a talk again in your life, which I was fine with because I never believed a word I said anyway. And we won't let anyone talk to you, anyone that you know for 40 years, you'll be completely cut off. I said, fine, you know. I was kind of done after that. So that night,
That included your brother.
included my brother, he was not allowed to speak to me, who was at that point like my best friend, you know, for most of my life. But I was just so done with it all. It was just so intense, you know, that whole world. So that night, I had to give back my orange robes, and they gave me two pairs of trousers, two shirts, and my bag and my British passport. And where do you go? Because my parents had now left England. A friend said, look, come and stay in my hotel in central London. I won't tell anyone that you're here. Just come and stay in my hotel. So I landed in December, end of December in London in civilian clothes
Mm.
after 20 years.
Wow. Yeah, 6 years of study. You did a pilgrimage in there too, 2,000 miles, 20 years of being a priest, and all of the emotional, physical, intellectual, spiritual sacrifice that you underwent came right down to that point. So you left as a 19-year-old from London. You returned as a 40-year-old
Yeah, 40.
in civilian clothes. Wow. So fast forward now, you're back in London. There's actually I want to read it to you. I don't know if you remember this part. I found it really striking. You make this comment as you're walking around in this newfound liberty around the streets of London. You said, I remember the day when I had been seated in a Range Rover or an Aston Martin, just wanting to get out and go for a wander alone. But here I was, wandering and eating whatever I chose and sitting wherever I wanted. So you had this newfound sense of freedom, of liberty.
Wow.
But can you just tell us, where were you back now in London, back home, with this newfound sense of freedom that you had not known for decades? Where were you with God in all of this at this point?
Disappointed with God. I knew I'd have some form of spirituality, so I gave up my search for God. Because that was like most of my prime life, I'd felt had just gone, right? And it felt like an empty pursuit. I mean, like you said, I did a 2,000-mile pilgrimage. I swam in the Ganges rivers, the Yamuna. I climbed sacred mountains. I did Mount Girnar 3 times. That's like 10,000 steps. You've got to start at 8 in the morning just so that you get back by 5, just to offer homage to the deities at the top of the mountain. So you kind of, after all that, and if you've not found God, you kind of are hugely, hugely disappointed. So I just gave up the search, you know. That's where I was at, really. I wanted to just find a simple job, quiet job,
That's
yeah,
interesting.
and just
Yeah.
get married, hopefully get married, and that was it. You know, I thought, okay, I've done enough. I think that was enough. Um, find a
Mm.
job.
Yeah. Live a normal life, a quiet life. It's interesting that you say after all that searching, because then comes that day, mid-January 2012. You're walking to South Kensington Station in London. You're not searching per se, you're just walking, and then something catches your eye. Can you tell us about that day and what you experienced?
Yeah, mid Jan. So the owner of the hotel, who was my friend, said, "Look, just for 4 weeks, don't think about job. Just walk around on your own. You've never walked on your own. Everywhere you've traveled, you've had people around you." So I was going to South Kensington Station. It's a Sunday morning around 11:15, and I was just looking straight ahead, and my head turned to the right, you know, just randomly. There was no reason. And I saw this church down this quiet road, and I thought, probably like the ones I've seen in Italy and Portugal with these beautiful paintings and mosaics and ornate, architecture. Let's have a look. So I went down this road, and it was 11:15 a.m. And as I entered the entrance of the church, there were two people at the entrance, with these incredible smiles, as if, they had eaten a banana sideways, and they were just so loving, and it was so creepy. That love was so creepy. You'd never witnessed that. So they've moved back to Australia. They're friends of mine, Sarah and Josh, and hi, how you doing? I thought, blimey, that's too much love, and I just walked past them. But as I walked past them and I stepped into the church, that's when the presence of God just fell on me so beautifully, like this blanket of tangible peace, And that voice, that same voice that was there in 1991 in the monastery, it came back and it said, "You're home." And that was it, "You're home." Again, it wasn't audible, but a real sense that someone just said, "You're home." And then I went inside this church, and there was worship going on with guitars and drums that I'd never seen. I sat upstairs in the pew, away from everyone. But for some weird reason, the sermon made sense. You know, the worship was beautiful. I just found this incredible joy inside me. I went straight back to my hotel, back to my room, and the manager of the hotel is still a friend of mine. So a few months ago, he showed me the room I was in. Um, this is 2012 January. I sat on the bed on the corner, and I gave my life to Christ in that instant, on that day, without anyone. Yeah.
What you're sharing there, it reminds me of a conversation that Julie, my wife, and I just had this last Sunday with this lady at our church. She just became a Christian, and she came up to us after the service, and we were chatting away over a cup of tea, and she kind of leans in and she says, "Can you help me understand something? I just don't understand all the excitement. Like, why are you guys so excited that I've become a Christian?" And
Yeah.
I love the questions. I'd never been asked that question before, and it made me think a little bit. But just the way that you reflect in your own story there, it occurred to me in the moment as I'm chatting with this lady. Well, we can relate to people in many different ways in this life. Biologically, siblings, parents, legally through marriage, obviously socially with friends, but spiritual relationship is something that's deeper, particularly for Christians, because it goes beyond the grave, and I guess the reason why we're so excited is because you've joined the family,
Mm,
and you're home, which is your words there, I'm home. And it's interesting, that motif of home from beginning to end of your book, it's all the way through, and I found that really quite beautiful, the way that you wove that in there, as well as that little still small voice that you
mm.
were mentioning. But I am curious, as you're sitting there in that hotel room on that bed, um, what was Jesus? What was it that you were? How much did you know
Nothing.
about Jesus that you
All
were
I
signing
remember
up to?
saying,
Like when you say yes to Him, nothing.
nothing. All I said was yes, yes. I kept saying yes, yes, yes. That's all I remember saying, and that's what I only said. Until then, several months later, as I started going to church, I had a powerful encounter with the Holy Spirit, and then, this is not just a beautiful tradition. He is alive. This is real. These are not just words that Jesus is alive or He's with you. This is this is tangible. This is real, and it was in that moment, and then later on, when I had that encounter, I kind of understood the difference between karma and grace. You know, here in this Christian world, by that time, I had no job, I had no food. The hotel guy kicked me out because he knew I was going to church. It was a pretty desperate situation. And I went to a prayer meeting, and I just stood there, and the Holy Spirit just came and overwhelmed me so beautifully. I thought, goodness, this is what all the people I read about, Arvinda, Vivekananda, all these people who went through incredible methodology, this is what they wanted through karma, through effort, through earning. And here, I just stood there in a mess, and God came and powerfully touched my heart, and it was just, I thought, wow, wow. I'm just standing here, reluctant, almost, and God comes, and it just gave me such. It was the starting point of the difficulty of karma and grace. This is not where I please Him or work for Him or earn His favor. It's where I learn to be and loved, and I'm justified already. That was also a massive kind of shifting that had to take place, which was took a while. That took a while. I mean, it still continues, but the major, yeah, the major turning took a good 2 years. Because I like, what do I do for Jesus? What do I do for Jesus? Which college should I go to? Which Bible? And God was very clear. Can you just sit with me? That's all I need you to do. And that was so hard. But I had to. I knew. I just knew. I had very godly friends. I knew that that's what He wanted to embed in me. To just sit. I don't want you to do anything. Just sit with me. Sit alone with me, and cultivate that lifestyle of intimacy and presence, and then I'll show you where to go after that. And so, yeah,
I love that, and the contrast of karma and grace. I mean, that's yeah. I often it's grace is God's work, not our work, and that's why it works. And it's really quite a distinctive of Christianity that He actually rolled up His sleeves and did what we could not. Um,
yeah.
Rahil, your story and your life, you're so uniquely positioned to speak to both the East and the West in so many ways. But now, as a Christian, as you look at specifically the Christian church, you touched on this earlier, but I am curious, are there certain ideas or disciplines that you think we could learn from Hinduism?
I think very quickly, because I think this, instead of learning from Hinduism, is learning from other Christian traditions is where I would like to go. And when you look at Protestant Christianity, one understands the history of its creation in the 1500s. But I do believe, after much reading, that a lot of beautiful things were thrown out as well, you know? And I often say that you practice your faith within the tradition you're in, but do notice the beauty in other Christian traditions, whether it's the Greek Orthodox or the Catholics. And, when you look at what these monasteries, Christian monasteries, did in the Middle East in the 4th century, and the evangelism they did after that, my goodness, it's mind blowing. All the way to China, all the way to Sri Lanka, to Japan, you know. But these were people like Teresa of Avila, Brother Lawrence, who wrote the book Practicing the Presence of God. You've got Madame Guyon, Julian of Norwich, St. John of the Cross. The psychologist Dr. Gerald May said that Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross were years ahead of Carl Jung in understanding the complexities of the soul. So I would say practices of contemplation, meditation, you know, they're not disciplines, they're expressways of romance, you know. When a Westerner hears the word discipline, they often think punishment because you think of a typical boarding school, right? Discipline can come out of unhealthy religion, but it can come out of romance as well, right? When you're in love with someone, you cultivate discipline so that you can be with that someone. When you're hungry for food, you're able to navigate your day so that you can eat food however busy you are, right? When you're thirsty, you don't think about thirst. You don't write it in the diary, or I'll drink on Sunday morning from 9 to 12, right? It's a natural thing. And what I'm fascinated with is the traditions of the Desert Fathers, um, who didn't park their brains at the door, which is what I think a lot of Western Christians think. They're highly intellectual individuals, you know. These were phenomenal people, like the nunnery that Martin Luther's wife, Catherine von Bora, came from, and the enterprise that she set up, you know, for Martin Luther. It's just mind blowing that she had this combination of contemplative, meditative, beautiful romance with Christ, and yet she had the capacity to even apply her mind to business, whereby by 1542 they had the most land in Wittenberg, you know. And so a lot of beautiful traditions from ancient Christianity have been taken into Islam and the Hindu traditions, right? And I think Tim Keller, in one of his speeches, writes if John Chrysostom came back today, he would find more affiliation with his era of Christianity and Islam than American evangelicalism. Just to give you an idea, what Muslims do 5 times a day, the namaz, is a direct, identical copy of the Syrian Christian monks of the 5th and 6th century. Even the design of a mosque is taken from Syrian Orthodox monks. So there's so much richness, you know, in the Christian tradition. And I would say that, you know, it's all beautiful in there. You know, you can worship with your mind, engage with the word. You can do charismatic worship and engage with the presence. But you can also do contemplation. You can do meditation. You can sit quietly in the presence of God, you know. And these are all practices within Christian tradition. But because they're not being offered, and just a linear, cerebral, argumentative form of Christianity is offered more often than not in the West, Westerners are drawn to these Eastern practices. You know, it was a really interesting conversation with a friend of ours who's looking at data for the Church of England. And she said a lot of now young Christians are going to churches where there's more silence and solitude because they're already getting the exposure of fog machines and disco lights and guitars and drums in the nightclubs that they're exposed to, right? So I just think that these are my thoughts. I'm not saying that you have to do that, but I just think there's such a richness. When I read East and West traditions, you kind of see it's all there in our heritage. We're just not tapping into it and offering it, which is why a lot of Westerners go east. Christianity is an Eastern religion. You know, I said in a meeting a few weeks ago, my friend asked me, "So what do you do?" I said, "I oversee the Eastern religions at OCCA." He goes, "What do you mean? All religions are Eastern. There's no such thing as a Western religion, right?" So just the understanding that this is a we're practicing a Middle Eastern a religion that was based in the Middle East, right, which spilled over into India. You know, the impeccable evidence of Thomas going into India. You look at some of the Hindu traditions, they're very Christian. Some of the Hindu practices, they're very Christian in their roots. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I appreciate that on many levels. As a student of the Bible, just trying to get reading Jesus through Middle Eastern eyes. As a member of a church, trying to remember that it's bigger than the walls that I meet in on a Sunday.
Yeah, yeah,
Global Christianity, having our eyes on what's going on around the world with the stresses and the pressures and the beautiful, rich, multi-variegated colors of Christian worship and liturgy. And, we actually recently did a video essay, a long form YouTube clip on Christian differences in church denominations here at Questioning Christianity. And often that's presented as a problem if it's so true, why there's so many different expressions. But it's because it's universally reaching that it's found to be so varied. It's a core truth that is expressed in multiple different ways, and I actually think that's a real positive argument in favor for the universality of the gospel, is the
Yeah.
multiple expressions that we find around the world. So, um, look, just wrapping this up. As you've grown in your Christian faith, could you speak to somebody that might be listening to this? You've reflected beautifully this voice in your work, and even in this chat that we've had today, this voice that was there speaking to you. If somebody is wanting to know why Jesus, in this world of competing religious and irreligious claims, all sorts of people searching, all sorts of places for meaning and purpose and love, as the title of your book says, found by love. Why do you think that search ends ultimately with Jesus? What does Jesus offer for people?
Oh gosh, that's a beautiful question. When it was just so bizarre that Thomas was told, "I am the truth, the way, and life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And it was Thomas that went to India, of all places, where historically, according to the Rig Veda verse is Ekam Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. There is one God in many paths, so that whole world is always, you've got your path, I've got my path. But when you try those different paths, I think one thing it's a heavy word and and a hard word. Your your nature of sin does follow you wherever you go, whether it's into a retreat center for yoga, or whether it's you know when you put your headphones on to do a meditation app like Headspace. When you encounter Jesus, the transformation isn't just transformation, but there's a cleansing of conscience. There's an ongoing cleansing of guilt and shame that we all struggle with. This is at the very basic level. I'm not even coming to heaven and sitting with God. That's the first thing. I think anyone who endeavors other paths, right? And I say this from my own experience, however hard you try, you'll always feel that you're falling short. And you'll always have to grapple with guilt and shame and self condemnation. And however much self talk you do, meditation you do, chanting you do, alternative thinking practices you do, that deeply rooted thing of guilt and shame, you know, that will always remain there. It'll be a burden, it'll be heavy. And you can try your best to justify that, you can try your best to distract yourself from that with other spiritual methods, but it will be there. It's only in the meeting of Jesus Christ that that burden is lifted of condemnation, guilt, shame on anything, not just your spiritual practices, but the way you've lived your life, what's happened in the past. I am not saying that Jesus endorses sin and bad behavior, but the flaws and failures that we come across in our own lives, whatever spiritual path we pursue, becomes so evident, so stark, it's shocking, and it will always take you to guilt and shame and condemnation. In the Christian walk with Christ, it's revealed, but then it's dealt with by Him with a freedom, with a lightness, with joy. He doesn't show it to your mirror and say, "Hey, look at you." He says, "Look, hey, this is something we can do. We can sort this." And He does it. So I think at that very basic level of living life, I would say that that's the thing here. And then after that, I would say that there is a tangible peace in his life that surpasses all understanding. Jesus, the peace in the kingdom of God is not like the peace the world is offering. The peace that the world is offering, or retreat center this or that, is absence from chaos, right? And that's only short lived. Jesus is a person. He is the Prince of Peace. And when he's in your life, you can have that in the midst of chaos, right? So there's a huge difference. You don't have to go to a cave. I'm talking again, just day to day living in this chaotic, confusing world. That tangible presence of God's peace is available. So, and that peace also transforms. And then we can get to the theological differences in the arguments of salvation and heaven and hell. That's another story altogether. But what I would say to the viewers is, what are you searching for when you go through other methods? This retreat center, that mindfulness, or that place in the Bahamas, or whatever your thing is, that yoga. What is it that you want? You actually want an absence from chaos in your inner self and outside. That's impossible, because sin and guilt and shame will follow you there. And when you come out of the retreat center, chaos is there. There's only one person that can give you that peace, that redemption from guilt and shame in the midst of chaos and in this life, in the position you're in. Your finances might not change, your relationships might not change, your career might not change, but his profound joy, which is not just an intellectual idea, it's a tangible reality, is in that. And we see that in history. Right? We see that in Christian history as well. Just a few meters down across the road from me, you have the Martyrs Memorial, where Ridley, Mortimer, and Latimer, they were being burnt alive. And it's remarkable. One of the three who was being burnt alive for translating the Bible into English, he says to the other guy, "Be of great joy, Master Ridley, as for tonight a fire will burn in England that will never burn out." He's being burnt alive, and he's saying this. And you think, how can you have joy in that circumstance? Genuine, authentic joy. You can't self-talk that. It's only grace and the presence of Christ that can be so much on you while you're being burnt alive. I mean, that's an extreme example of the closeness of God in chaos. And I think that's what people are seeking and searching. You know, they want that deep sense of peace, free from shame, guilt, and condemnation. And here and now, that's what Jesus can offer. Only Jesus can offer that. And like I said, the other theological differences in the afterlife or salvation, heaven, hell, is another whole sermon of its own. But what are you seeking through these other paths? What is it that you want? And here it is on offer, right? That's what I would say.
I appreciate that, Rahil, and I think that's from a man who's explored so much of the world, so much of what religion, East and West, has to offer. I think that's a really fitting final word. Christianity isn't just another off-the-shelf option. It is something that is revolutionary. It's an encounter with a living God who brings a deep personal, intellectual, emotional, spiritual satisfaction to our lives, and a love, as you say, found by love, your home. Rahil, I just want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Thank you for being vulnerable, for sharing your story with the world. And I really want to encourage anyone listening to this to get onto Amazon and find that book, Found by Love, A Hindu Priest Encounters Jesus by Rahil Patel. Rahil, may God bless you and your family.
Thank you.
Look forward to catching up soon.
Thanks, David, for your generosity as well and your time as well, and your friendship. Lovely to see you again. Give my love to the family.